The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, the kind that cost more per sheet than Layla Brennan's hourly rate when she first started at Ashford Capital 3 years ago. It had been placed on her desk sometime between her morning coffee run and her 9 o'clock, which meant someone had been in her office while she was gone. Someone who had a key or someone who knew where to get one. Layla turned it over in her hands before opening it. The Ashford Foundation cordially invites you to the annual charity gala Grand Calloway Hotel, Midtown Manhattan Saturday, the 15th black tie. Her name had been written by hand across the front. She recognized the penmanship, precise, forward-slanting, no wasted motion. Vivienne Ashford wrote the way she spoke, like every word was a decision she'd already won. Layla set the envelope down on her desk and looked at the door. Through the glass panel she could see the open floor of Ashford Capital. Analysts bent over dual monitors, phones pressed to ears, the quiet machinery of other people's money grinding forward. Nobody looked her way. Nobody ever did unless they needed something corrected or needed someone to blame. She'd been invited to exactly one firm event in 3 years. A welcome lunch that Vivienne had left 15 minutes into. This was something different. She knew why. 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday that had started like every other Tuesday, Layla had been running a routine audit on the Meridian portfolio, a mid-sized collection of real estate and private equity holdings that technically sat under Gerald Ashford's name but that nobody at the firm ever touched directly. It was background noise. Old money sitting still. Except it wasn't sitting still. Buried in a secondary ledger. One that hadn't been flagged for quarterly review, one that Layla only found because a formula error sent her 3 tabs deeper than she was supposed to go, were transfers. Clean on the surface, patterned underneath. 12 transactions over 18 months, each routed through a different shell entity, each landing in an account registered in the Cayman Islands under a name she didn't recognize. The amounts weren't small. Neither was the implication. She'd sat at her desk for 11 minutes without moving. Then she'd closed the file, logged out, and gone to the bathroom and run cold water over her wrist the way her mother had taught her to do when panic started climbing. She hadn't reported it. She hadn't told anyone. She was 27 years old from Delphos, Ohio, and she had $31,000 in student loan debt and no family in this city, and whatever she had stumbled into was so far above her pay grade that the altitude alone might have killed her. She'd decided to forget it. But you don't forget things like that. You just get good at pretending you have. That evening she called Dee. Deandra Williams had been her roommate freshman year at Ohio State, the only person in New York who knew that Layla still slept with a childhood quilt her grandmother had made, that she couldn't parallel park to save her life, and that she sometimes cried at commercials about dogs. "Don't go," Dee said before Layla had even finished reading the invitation aloud. "I can't just not go. It's Vivienne. It's a trap. You don't know that. Layla." Dee's voice was flat. "A woman who has never once acknowledged your existence in 3 years hand-delivers you a personal gala invitation. That's not an honor. That's a setup." Layla looked out her apartment window. The city was doing what it always did at dusk, going gold, then gray, then swallowing itself in electric light. 17 stories below, taxis were stacking up on Lexington Avenue. Somewhere out there, people were having normal evenings. "I'll be fine," she said. "You always say that. And I'm always fine." Dee was quiet for a moment. "Call me the second you get home. I don't care what time it is. Deal." After she hung up, Layla moved to her closet. She owned 2 formal dresses. One was red, which felt too bold for a room she was already going to struggle to belong in. The other was navy, simple, elegant, conservative. It had a low back and cost her $400 on sale, which she justified as an investment in looking like she belonged somewhere better than where she was. She unzipped the garment bag. Started getting dressed. She thought, as she stepped into the dress, about the first day she'd walked into Ashford Capital. She'd taken the express train from her studio in East Harlem, standing the whole way because she'd been too nervous to sit, telling herself that she had earned this. The internship, then the analyst position, then the quiet, grinding years of being the person in every room who worked twice as hard and got thanked half as much. She had come from a place where the biggest financial institution was a credit union on Route 30, and she had taught herself everything else from books and late nights and mistakes she never made twice. She had been proud of that. For a while. Somewhere along the way, the pride had gotten quieter, the way things do when they go unwitnessed for long enough. She zipped the dress, smoothed the back, and looked at herself in the mirror on the back of the closet door. A woman in navy. Composed. Careful. Ready in every outward sense, for a room she had not been invited into for any good reason. "Don't go," Dee had said. She reached for her earrings, small gold hoops inherited from her mother, and put them in one at a time. She was going. Across the city, in a townhouse on the Upper West Side, Vivienne Ashford sat in the white armchair of her private study with her legs crossed and her phone in her hand. On the screen was a PDF, 12 pages, professionally formatted, bearing the header of Ashford Capital's Internal Compliance Department. And at the top of the key summary page in clean black type, was a name. Analyst, Layla Brennan. Vivienne had spent 4 days working on the document. She'd been careful enough that a routine review would find nothing wrong with it, careful enough that the formatting matched the firm's templates exactly, careful enough that anyone who looked at it would see a clear, documented trail of a junior analyst who had accessed files she shouldn't have and altered what she found there. The story was clean. The paper trail was clean. Layla Brennan had no allies in that building and no history with anyone who mattered, and by the end of Saturday evening she would have no future there either. Vivienne smiled. It was a small, contained smile, the kind that never reached her eyes because it wasn't meant to. It was the smile of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the other person to realize it. She set the phone face down on the armrest, picked up her champagne and went back to her evening. The Grand Calloway Hotel had been built in 1923 by a railroad baron who wanted New Yorkers to feel small when they walked through his doors. It had succeeded every decade since. The ceilings in the main ballroom soared 40 feet and were gilded at the edges. The chandeliers alone were insured for more than most buildings in the zip codes Layla had grown up in. She arrived at 8, which she'd thought was fashionably on time. She was wrong. The room was already 3/4 full, already loud with the specific sound of people performing ease they had spent their whole lives buying. Waitstaff moved through the crowd like water around stone. Somewhere near the back, a string quartet played something European and melancholy. Layla gave her name at the door. The woman checking the list found it, marked it, and looked up with a smile that stopped at her cheekbones. Inside, she took a glass of champagne she didn't intend to drink and tried to get her bearings. She spotted 3 colleagues from the firm within the first 2 minutes. All 3 looked at her. None of them came over. Marcus Elbridge, a senior analyst 2 levels above her, said something to the woman beside him and they both glanced in Layla's direction, then away. She kept her face neutral. Kept moving. The whispers started before she'd made it halfway across the room. She couldn't catch exact words at first, just the texture, that particular drop in register, the careful angle of someone's head, the practiced disinterest of eyes that were actually watching very closely. Then she was close enough to a cluster of people near the bar to hear one sentence, delivered without looking at her. She's the one who falsified the Meridian audit. Layla's grip tightened on her champagne flute. She kept walking. She did not stop. She did not turn around. She found a spot near the tall windows overlooking 54th Street and stood there with the city behind her and breathed, slowly, the way you breathe when you're keeping something from showing on your face. Falsified. The word sat in her chest like a stone. She hadn't falsified anything. She had found something she was never supposed to find, and then she had done nothing, which she'd told herself was wisdom and which she now understood was exactly what someone had been counting on. Vivienne hadn't invited her here to honor her. She'd invited her here because a setup requires a subject, and Layla was the most convenient one available. Junior enough to be disposable, isolated enough to have no one who would argue on her behalf, just credible enough that her name on a compliance document would be believed without much question. Layla understood all of this in the span of about 4 seconds, standing at the window with the city going about its enormous, indifferent business 40 feet below. She thought about leaving. She actually mapped the route in her mind. The windows were behind her, the main doors were across the room, the coat check was to the left. She could be in a cab in 4 minutes, home in 20. And then what? Wait for Monday morning, when the same document that was presumably circulating right now in whispered handoffs would arrive in her inbox via official channels. She had spent 3 years at Ashford Capital waiting for rooms to stop being against her. She was tired of waiting. She straightened her spine and turned back toward the ballroom. The room shifted. It was subtle, the way these things always are. A slight restructuring of bodies, a collective adjustment of attention, the way a crowd unconsciously orients itself around a new center of gravity. Layla felt it before she identified it. She looked toward the main entrance. Roman Steele had arrived. She knew who he was the way everyone in any room with money knew who Roman Steele was, not from having met him but from the careful, involuntary study you did of people whose names came up too often in too many different kinds of conversations. Steele Capital Group. 35 years old. Never photographed at anything he didn't choose to attend. The kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. He was taller than she'd expected. Dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt open in a way that somehow read as more formal than everyone else's black tie. He moved through the room without stopping, without hurrying, with the quiet ease of a man who has never in his life had to wait for anything to get out of his way. And then, across 40 feet of gilded ballroom, his eyes found hers. It lasted 2 seconds. Maybe 3. She looked away first. She didn't know why. When she looked back, he was already somewhere else, already being absorbed into a knot of men with gray hair and significant handshakes. But something about those 2 seconds stayed on her skin. She didn't see Vivienne make her move. She only understood it in retrospect. Later, she would piece together the sequence. Vivienne crossing the room around 8:40, pausing near the Gala committee table, the folded papers passing from one manicured hand to another. The committee chair, a tall woman named Patricia Gould who ran a philanthropic foundation and appeared on the cover of 3 different magazines a year, reading something with a small, concerned frown. A second person leaning in. A third. All Layla noticed in the moment was that Vivienne had smiled at her from across the room. A small smile. Contained. The smile of someone who had already won. Things are about to get worse before Roman steps in. Subscribe to Nikolai Stories so you don't miss a single twist. New story drop every day. Roman Steele had been watching Layla Brennan for 47 minutes before anyone else in the room understood what was happening. He had a talent for this, for reading a room the way other people read a ledger, tracking the small movements and micro-adjustments that told you where the weight was shifting before the shift became visible. It was the skill that had kept him alive in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and it was the skill that had first made him notice the woman in the navy dress standing near the windows like she was trying to decide whether to stay or run. She was not what he'd come here for. He'd come because Gerald Ashford had been on his radar for 18 months, because Steele Capital's intelligence on the man's offshore activity had reached a threshold that required personal attention, and because Roman had learned long ago that you don't send other people to do the work that requires you to see things with your own eyes. But he'd noticed her. He noticed her because she was the only person in the room who wasn't performing anything. Everyone else, the socialites, the executives, the old money and the new, they were all playing versions of themselves, calibrated for the audience, polished to a specific shine. The woman in the navy dress was just standing there, in the middle of it, looking like someone trying very hard not to drown. He'd noticed when the whispers started near the bar. Noticed her jaw tighten, her pace adjust, the champagne glass she'd held for 20 minutes without drinking. He'd noticed Marcus Elbridge say something ugly to someone and look pleased about it. He'd flagged her. Filed her away. Then he'd watched Vivienne Ashford cross the room and hand Patricia Gould a folder of documents, and he'd understood exactly what was about to happen. He was already moving before Patricia Gould stood up. The committee chair's voice carried the way voices do in large rooms when everyone has unconsciously gone quiet to listen. Miss Brennan. Layla turned. Roman watched her face. The confusion first, then the quick calculation, then the beginning of fear she was working very hard to keep from showing. Could you join me for a moment? Patricia Gould's tone was carefully neutral in the way that neutral becomes a weapon. She was holding papers. There's a matter regarding the Meridian portfolio audit that some of our members have raised concerns about. Given that your name appears on the documentation, we thought it appropriate to address it directly. The room didn't gasp. It was too trained for that. But the attention converged. The subtle pivot of shoulders, the stilling of glasses halfway to mouths, the particular silence of 300 people collectively deciding to watch. Phones appeared. Roman crossed the last 20 feet in 8 steps. He came in from Layla's left, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who belongs everywhere he goes, and he stopped beside her, not behind, not slightly ahead. Beside. He didn't touch her. He didn't look at her. He looked at Patricia Gould and he smiled, and it was not a warm smile. Patricia, he said. I don't think that's going to be necessary. The room got quieter. Roman felt rather than saw Layla turn to look at him. Patricia Gould blinked. She was not a woman who blinked often. Mr. Steele. I wasn't aware you had an interest in this matter. I have an interest in accuracy. He held out his hand. May I? A beat. Patricia handed him the papers. He reviewed them at a pace that communicated he was not in any hurry and that everyone waiting could continue waiting. He turned 2 pages. Then he looked up. These documents have been altered, he said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The transfer records attributed to Ms. Brennan reference a file version that didn't exist on the date marked. The metadata's been stripped, but the sequence numbers don't match the Ashford Capital internal systems format from that quarter. He set the papers down on the nearest table. Someone created these after the fact. Ms. Brennan's name was added. She had nothing to do with what's in that file, because what's in that file doesn't correspond to any audit she actually ran. He knew this because his people had found the real documents 14 months ago. Because Gerald Ashford's actual financial activity was already in a secure folder in Roman's office. Because the falsification was Vivienne's and it was good. But not good enough for someone who had been looking at the original for over a year. The silence in the room had a different quality now. Vivienne Ashford was standing 15 feet away. Roman looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to let her understand that he knew, that he had known, and that the document she'd handed Patricia Gould had just become evidence of something she hadn't planned for. Her face was very still. All the color had left it. Roman turned to Layla. This close, he could see that her hands were completely steady, which told him more about her than anything else in the room. She wasn't trembling. She was furious and she was holding it with both hands and she was doing it without flinching. He offered her his arm. She looked at it. Then she looked at him, a direct, clear-eyed look that asked 3 questions at once without saying a word. He held her gaze. He didn't explain himself. He wasn't going to. After a moment she took his arm. The room parted for them the way it always parted for Roman Steele. They walked out of the ballroom together and no one followed and no one spoke until they were in the elevator, and the doors had closed and they were alone. Then Layla Brennan said very quietly, "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching Gerald Ashford for a long time," Roman said. The elevator descended. "That's not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building on East 73rd Street that didn't have its address listed anywhere a civilian would think to look. The elevator required a key card and a code. The living room was the size of Layla's entire apartment, but it didn't feel large. It felt precise, like every piece of furniture had been placed according to a logic she hadn't been given access to yet. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the park. At this hour, Central Park was a dark shape pressed between 2 walls of light, and the city beyond it went on in every direction until it blurred into something that looked, from this height, almost like order. Roman had said almost nothing in the car. Cole, his cousin who had appeared outside the hotel with the kind of calm efficiency that suggested he'd been expecting to leave early, had driven. Layla had sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and her mind running very fast in a very small space. Now she stood near the windows while Roman poured 2 glasses of whiskey at the bar along the far wall. He brought them over. She didn't take hers. He set it on the low table beside her without comment and kept his own. "Gerald Ashford has been moving money for approximately 2.5 years, Roman said. He didn't sit. He stood a few feet from her, drink in hand, and spoke the way people speak when they are used to being listened to without having to perform for it. Offshore accounts. Shell entities. A rotation pattern designed to look like normal portfolio activity to anyone running a standard quarterly audit. But not a non-standard one, Layla said. No. Not if you followed the sequence numbers 3 tabs deeper than the assigned file. She looked at him. You know about the Tuesday audit. I know about a lot of things, Ms. Brennan. Then you know I didn't report it. I know why you didn't report it. He said it without judgment, which was somehow worse than if he'd been critical. You were alone, you were junior, and you'd found something that could end your career or your safety depending on who you told. Staying quiet was a rational decision. It was a coward's decision. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She looked away. Out at the park. The city. The dark mass of trees that didn't care about any of this. The FBI has been building a case on Gerald Ashford for 14 months, Roman said. They got there on their own, I had nothing to do with it. But my people have been running a parallel track, for reasons that have nothing to do with federal law enforcement and everything to do with the fact that Ashford owes a significant debt to individuals I represent. She processed this. So you're not the good guy. I never said I was. You walked into that ballroom and defended me in front of 300 people. I walked into that ballroom and told the truth about a forged document. Those are related but not the same thing. Layla turned back to him. He was watching her with that same steady attention he'd had in the ballroom, the kind of watching that felt like being read rather than looked at. The document Vivienne handed Patricia Gould, she said. If it's evidence of forgery, it is. Then Vivienne just handed a federal investigation the thing they needed to connect Gerald's financial manipulation to an active cover-up attempt. She paused. She didn't know that. She thought she was protecting Gerald by framing you. She didn't know the feds were already inside the accounts. Roman's mouth curved slightly. She also didn't know I was going to be in that room. Were you there because of me? I was there because of Gerald. He held her gaze. You were a variable I hadn't planned for. Layla thought about that for a moment. Then, I have a folder. Roman went very still. On my personal laptop. Encrypted. I copied the irregularities I found that Tuesday, the transfer sequences, the account numbers, the routing pattern. I told myself it was just for my own records. In case I ever needed to prove I hadn't touched anything. She looked at him steadily. If the feds are building a case, that folder has 18 months of clean, unaltered source data. The kind they wouldn't have been able to pull from Ashford's systems after Gerald started covering his tracks. The silence in the room was different from the silence at the gala. That had been the silence of performance. This was the silence of two people recalibrating. That folder, Roman said carefully, would close the case. I know. And you're telling me about it. I'm deciding whether to, she said. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly, but its more complicated cousin. Recognition maybe. The particular kind that happens when you see something you weren't expecting to see. You're not afraid of me, he said. I'm extremely afraid of you. I'm choosing not to let that be the thing that decides what I do next. He was quiet. Then he set down his whiskey. The right thing to do, he said, is take that folder to the FBI. Directly. Not through me. I know that too. I can give you a name. Someone I trust not to bury it. Why would you trust anyone in federal law enforcement? Because the enemy of my enemy, Roman said simply, occasionally keeps his word. From somewhere deeper in the penthouse, a door opened. Cole appeared in the hallway, unhurried, and crossed to Roman. He held out an envelope without preamble. Roman opened it. Read the single line inside. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He handed it to Layla. 4 words, handwritten. Vivienne just lawyered up. Layla looked at the paper for a long moment. Then she set it on the table beside the untouched whiskey. Then we're running out of time, she said. Roman isn't playing hero, he's playing chess. Don't miss what comes next. Like, share, and subscribe to Nicoai's Stories to stay ahead of the story. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning that smelled like rain and bus exhaust and the first real cold of autumn, Layla Brennan walked up the steps of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Federal Courthouse on Pearl Street and testified before a grand jury. She wore a charcoal blazer she'd pressed the night before. She carried a leather portfolio that held printed copies of everything. The transfer sequences, the routing numbers, the 18 months of source data she'd pulled from Gerald Ashford's buried ledger on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. The originals were already logged into evidence. The FBI agent whose name Roman had given her, a woman named Torres who had short hair and a handshake like a closing door, had spent 6 hours with Layla 2 days after the gala, going through every file line by line. Torres had said, "This is the cleanest parallel documentation I've seen in 12 years. Layla had said, "I kept it because I was scared. I'm giving it to you because I'm tired of being scared." It was, as it turned out, exactly what they needed. Gerald Ashford was formally indicted on 11 counts of wire fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, and 1 count of obstruction of justice on a Monday morning. The indictment listed his shell entities by name, traced the routing pattern across 3 continents, and cited, in clean federal language, the source documentation provided by a cooperating witness whose identity was protected by the court. Vivienne Ashford, facing her own charges for the forged documents she'd presented at the gala, which had, in the worst possible way for her, been witnessed by 300 people including one Roman Steele, resigned from Ashford Capital the following Thursday. Her attorney released a statement. Her firm released a statement. The financial press released 12 articles in 48 hours, most of them using the word downfall. Layla did not read the articles. She went to work. She answered the emails she needed to answer and ignored the rest, and at the end of each day, took the subway home and heated something up and called Dee and did not talk about any of it until she was ready. On the morning of the courthouse testimony, Dee had called at 6 a.m. Ohio time. "You good?" Dee had asked. "I'm good. You sure?" "I copied those files because some part of me knew I'd need them eventually. I just didn't let myself know I knew." Layla had looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, blazer on, hair back, a face that looked calmer than she felt. "I've been ready for this for 18 months. I just needed someone to finally clear the room." Dee had been quiet for a moment. Then, "Is someone tall and dangerous and not technically a good guy?" Layla had hung up. She came out of the courthouse at 11:47. The sky had gone the color of old pewter and there was a wind coming off the East River that cut through her blazer like it wasn't there. Reporters were waiting at the base of the steps. 3 cameras, a handful of people with microphones, the particular hungry alertness of people who know something is about to be confirmed. Layla walked through them without stopping. She knew how to do this now. You look straight ahead. You don't fill silence. You let them have the picture they're going to take regardless, and you keep moving. At the bottom of the steps she turned east. There was a black Mercedes parked half a block down, on the wrong side of a sign that clearly said no standing. The engine was on. Through the windshield she could see Roman Steele in the driver's seat, no Cole, no one else, just him watching the courthouse steps with the same expression he'd had in that ballroom. Steady. Unreadable. Refusing to look away. She had not seen him since the night at the penthouse. He had texted her Torres's name and number, and she had said thank you, and he had not replied, and she had told herself that was fine, and it was fine, and it had also been 3 weeks of intermittently not being fine about it. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then she walked to his car. She got in the passenger side without knocking, without waiting for an invitation. The interior smelled like leather and cold air and something faintly wood smoke. He didn't say anything. He looked at her, that same direct, reading look, and waited. It went well, she said. I know. Torres texted me. Of course she did. Layla looked at her hands in her lap, then out at the street. A taxi edged past them, close enough to be annoying, and neither of them acknowledged it. You could have reached out. I didn't think you needed me to. That's not the same thing as whether I wanted you to. A beat. The city moved around the still interior of the car, indifferent, continuous. You didn't need rescuing, Roman said. No. I didn't. She turned to look at him directly. I had the evidence. I had the truth. I just needed someone to be in that room who wasn't going to pretend they didn't see it. He held her gaze for a long moment. I don't do simple, he said. I want to be clear about that. What I am, what I run. None of it is simple. Anyone connected to me inherits complications. I work in financial forensics, Layla said. I just helped indict a man by tracing money through 4 shell entities across 3 continents. I'm familiar with complicated. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly. But the thing that lives next to a smile in a person who has mostly forgotten how. What do you want, Layla Brennan? She thought about Delphos, Ohio, and a desk on the 31st floor, and a Tuesday audit, and a cream envelope, and 300 people turning to watch her drown. She thought about a man who had crossed a ballroom and stood beside her, not to be her hero, but because the alternative was to look away, and he had decided, for reasons she was still working out, that he wasn't going to do that. I want, she said carefully, to see where something goes, without deciding what it is before it gets there. Roman Steele looked at her for a long moment. Then he put the car in drive. Neither of them spoke for another 10 blocks. The city scrolled past the windows, enormous and indifferent and quietly spectacular, and in the front seat of a black Mercedes on a gray Wednesday in October, 2 people who had no business being in the same room let themselves exist for now in the same one. She hadn't needed saving. She had needed a witness. And he had refused, from the first moment in that ballroom across 40 feet of gilded air, to look away. You didn't rescue me. No, he said. I just refused to look away. And that's a wrap. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to watch it. And subscribe to Nicoai's Stories for more stories that hit different. New drops every day. Don't miss it.